Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to release and reception. It is season 4, episode 2. We are doing an older movie. Chris, why don't you introduce the movie and our special guest for today's show?
I'd be happy to. Thanks, Dan. I wanted to make sure at some point in the show, and we're now in the 4th season, and it's kind of ridiculous that we haven't yet, because I think Dan and I both have a soft spot for this genre, the romantic comedy. We have kind of had our fair share of just like friend fights about various entries in the genre, but one that I don't think we've talked about yet, and that holds a weirdly special place in my heart, is the movie we're doing today. It's called One Fine Day, back from 1996. Is that really what I was going to say? Yes. 1996, starring Michelle Pfeiffer and George Clooney. Kind of forgotten, kind of not as much as other 96 rom-coms, I'm sure, but definitely not like a staple in the genre by any means. But I did want to make sure to bring on a guest of a podcast I've been listening to recently that delves exclusively into the rom-com genre. And so here's Michelle from Rom Com Weekly. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, guys. Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk.
Absolutely.
Well, I'd love to hear about your podcast. Kind of give us the lowdown on what you're doing in your podcast and what kind of episodes you've had recently.
Yeah, sure. So my podcast is called Rom Com Weekly. I usually release an episode once a week. That was the original goal, but I kind of set myself up for expectations when I named myself Rom Com Weekly. So on my podcast, I usually have a guest on, usually a friend of mine that's, just a fellow lover of rom-coms. And we dive into movies that are from the 90s to the present. So it's a long list, a pretty big library of rom-coms, good and bad and terrible. And for me, it's been really fun to revisit them as living in 2021, now as a 30-something-year-old woman, as an Asian American woman. Things have, my eyes have been opened to many, many things, and it's hard but really fun to revisit a lot of these movies.
What's a favorite episode recently that you've done? I saw you did 27 Dresses.
Yeah.
Oh man,
which I didn't listen to your episode yet. I love that movie. Is that a good or bad thing?
No, I think that I love 27 Dresses. It's a great movie. I think that movie came out in a very special time in my life also, in the sense that I was also just starting to go to weddings regularly. Yeah, so you kind of connect with characters when movies come out at a certain time. So yeah, I think Katherine Heigl is kind of underrated, to be honest.
Oh, absolutely. She's underrated. She's so good in that. Do you have, is there like a worst rom-com that you've done episode?
Oof.
Like, what would you think is your worst?
Yes. Don't get me wrong, they're bad, but I still watch them, and even sometimes multiple times, because they're just fun to watch. The Kissing Booth for me was...
Oh, really? The Netflix movie, right?
The Kissing Booth, Netflix film with Joey King, Jacob Elordi. It's an escape film, but I did not enjoy that movie very much.
Well, let's see where One Fine Day ends up.
Yes.
Chris, I need more on why you chose this. I really do.
Oh my gosh.
Because this is a tough one.
It is, and I'll readily admit that. But I thought that's why it would make for a good conversation, because here's a movie. I was trying to think of like a good analogy while I was rewatching it last night for the first time in many years, and I was kind of cozied up. I couldn't even get my wife to rewatch this movie with me, by the way. So I watched this by myself, and I'm trying to think of like what is it about this film that like drew it to me in the first place, makes me excited to revisit it. But I was also like kind of covered up with a blanket that's really comfortable, but it doesn't quite cover your feet. Do you know what I mean? Or it's like, I like this blanket, I just wish it was a little longer. It was just like it's missing something, but that's okay. And that's kind of how I feel about One Fine Day. It's missing a lot of things. It includes a lot of things that are completely superfluous, but also it feels so comfortable and lived in. And I just am a sucker, I think, for the especially romantic movies that take place over a short period of time. I think that's really fascinating to watch a film that's willing to take that risk of not only having a story, but also casting the right actors that can make you think they have chemistry over the course of a small time period like that. And that's definitely how I felt. And I also was doing like definitely some, reflecting, post being in therapy, kind of thinking about like why as a kid I was drawn to this film, because I definitely wasn't drawn to romance films as a young boy, but this one was like one of the only ones that was definitely a part of my like Saturday afternoon TBS repertoire, right? And it was, I think, largely it's personal. I'm gonna go full reader response here, and like I grew up with a kind of workaholic single mom, and it's a movie that has equal weight to both, not equal, but not unequal weight to both the kids and the parents, and it very much tries to somewhat, I'd say, honor that kind of dynamic that is very difficult for both the parent and the kid. And I don't think a lot of movies, at least from the 90s anyways, I'm sure there's movies from other decades that have done it much better, Kramer versus Kramer, what have you, but like that dynamic of the son and the single mom was probably a big factor for me personally.
And how did it feel rewatching it? Like what kind of flooded emotionally? What flooded it? Was it the good stuff, bad stuff? What?
It was a good old big some column A, some column B stuff, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm still gonna completely defend Michelle Pfeiffer in a Velociraptor t-shirt all day long. What the hell, costume designer? Anyways, like I think she's fantastic. I'm definitely one of those movie lovers, and I think it's almost like to a stereotype to a certain degree, where it's like Michelle Pfeiffer can do no wrong, and I think it just kind of finally clicked with me that like, yeah, I think I'm one of those people that truly thinks that, like, even in the really bad movies she's in, I think that she's magnetic. And I do think that George Clooney, I mean, this was kind of, even though it was a flop, and we'll get into that, I think that there's definitely a weird charm to him, and that was probably also like this personal look back at my past, where it's like he definitely represented the ideal of like the men my mom dated that were like absolute jerks, but he turns out to be not so much a jerk in the end. But all my mom's boyfriends just turned out to be jerks.
Wait, George Clooney doesn't turn out to be a jerk in the end of this?
Well, he at least gives you that. It does the rom-com final act turn.
Yeah.
And if any person can take that horrible character in that script and turn him into somebody that has like a softness to him, it's Clooney. Yeah. I can't think of any other actor that would have been able to pull that off. But also, clearly, it's open to interpretation whether or not you think he pulled it off.
Yeah, it's that ultimate turn. Like, doesn't that like it doesn't work in like a movie like The Ugly Truth? Y'all remember that one?
Oh God, yeah,
yeah, that's a rough one.
It's rough, and like he can't pull that off. Gerard Butler can't pull that off, because you're right. There is a certain sort of suaveness and charisma that you have to have in order to kind of be a jerk, but kind of come across as sort of soft and warm at the end. Michelle, kind of, what's your history with this film? Did you see it, long ago when it came out, or is this something a more recent watch for you?
I just, before I answer your question, I just want to say thank you, because this is a movie, and Chris, I agree with you. This is a special movie, I think, like that doesn't really get a lot of love. And to answer your question though, is I saw this in theaters in 1996. I have a very, very specific memory. And that's not always the case for me with a lot of movies, is that, so for some personal history, if I may, is that I moved from Chicago to New Jersey exactly in 1996. And it was over the holidays. And I think this movie came out in December of 96. And I met some family members that I didn't even know that I had. They were close to my age. And I think the parents wanted to hang out. So they kind of pushed all of us kids out to the movies. And for some reason, one of us chose One Fine Day. And I remember just being really excited, because rom-coms are my lane, obviously. But B, I was with kind of strangers. I didn't know who these people were that were my cousins and relatives. And then thirdly is that I remember being in the theater and just like seeing other like teenagers making out in movie theaters. And like, I think that was the first time I had seen that or observed that, oh, is this what people do in movie theaters? Is that they go and make out in the back? But I remember walking away from this movie being like, oh yeah, that was really cute. And I did actually revisit this movie recently. And yeah, it's still really fun. And I do love the dynamic between Michelle Pfeiffer and George Clooney. I think they have great chemistry. They bounce off each other really, really well. And I have to say, I love the 90s-ness of this movie. That to me is so amazing. This is one of the reasons why I love revisiting old movies, is just I am a huge sucker for nostalgia. And the huge cell phones and all that just brought me some joy. And I lived in New York for a really, really long time. So that also was another big, huge plus for me. I love rom-coms that take place in New York. And I always wonder if those movies that do take place in New York, if New York is supposed to be, you know, a third character. Mm-hmm. And for me, in One Fine Day, I do think it is. I think I read like one of the trivia points is that there were 44 different filming locations in Manhattan for this movie. And that's wild. That's a lot of work, you know, obviously to pick up and move your sets and stuff like that. But I love how New York-y this movie is, from like the Circle Line to Michelle Pfeiffer telling the cab drivers which streets to go on during certain times of day. And I kind of identified. I was like, wow, this is really, really real life for single parents in the 90s too. I don't know. This movie hasn't aged well in many ways. Yeah. But it still made me chuckle and made me laugh. And I did really enjoy watching the banter on screen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It definitely it has that nostalgia for the 90s and just massively. Yeah. It feels like you're in a time machine almost. Yeah. Chris, where did this film come from? Who's the director on this? Who are the writers? Did they go on to do anything else?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a weird thing. I half expected this to be one of those movies that I'd revisit and be like, oh yeah, that guy. Oh yeah, that person. But it's not. There's
nobody, right? Like, except for the actors.
Yeah, it's confusing, to be honest, on a number of levels. So first of all, it was written by a screenwriter pair, Terrell Seltzer and Ellen Simon, and they basically did little to nothing before they got their script. The only one they collaborated on together. For One Fine Day, Seltzer had done some script stuff on some Asian American independent movies in the 80s. Chan is Missing, Dim Sum, A Little Bit of Heart, and then did a very small comedy called How I Got Into College in '89, went to TV for a little bit, and then came with One Fine Day. Whereas Simon did one episode, not even a script, a story credit for an episode of 30-something, and then did Moonlight and Valentino, which she also wrote the play of in '95. Also still very under the radar, but a little less so than what Seltzer was up to. And for the director, they tapped Michael Hoffman, who is probably best known as the director of Soap Dish, the '91 comedy with Whoopi Goldberg and Robert Downey Jr. But other than that, he basically did nothing. He had a rom-com in '88 called Some Girls that flopped horribly. He had a prestige drama that flopped in '95 called Restoration. So basically just on Soap Dish. And Soap Dish got way bigger on home video than it ever was in the theater. So it's, you know, one of those cases of the white guy falling upwards in Hollywood. And he brings on, you know, one of the biggest 90s stars, Pfeiffer, and then also is in charge of like the transition from Clooney as TV star to film star, with his second feature film leading role after From Dusk Till Dawn that came out the same year. So it's like, what were they just like trying to like taking a gamble? But then also, like Michelle said, like they're heavily investing in you know, securing the shooting locations all over Manhattan, some like iconic places like Carnegie's Deli, and so like it probably didn't cost them much production wise, but it definitely took a lot of effort to wrangle everything together. So I'm curious what you think, Dan, what you think, Michelle, like, what do you think was kind of driving this? Is this just from the glut of rom-coms? It was produced by Linda Obst, who came up in the 80s with Flashdance and Adventures in Babysitting, and also was executive producer on Sleepless in Seattle. And was that the kicker? Is it
I think that's your key right there.
Okay.
Is you got the producer. I think there's probably some oral history of this movie out there somewhere, but my guess is that when Linda got Pfeiffer and Clooney on board, like, it's a done deal.
Mm-hmm.
And the script is kind of maybe even an afterthought. They may have, wanted to bring someone to rewrite. It doesn't really matter at that point, as long as you have the star power there. And the producer's going to basically shove the project forward no matter what. But I do kind of wonder, and you have this in our notes, like what the production budget was for this. Because as Michelle stated, it's shot in 44 locations in Manhattan. That's not cheap. You put Tin Cup as an example here. I think that's probably a pretty good corollary in terms of, or a comparable film. $45 million production budget in 1986. I don't know. It feels like it's going to be up there. If you got Clooney and you got Michelle Pfeiffer, they're super expensive actors.
Right.
So I don't know. I think it probably was in at least the 40 to, I'd probably say a little bit higher, like 50 to 55, 50 to 60 maybe. I couldn't find anything on that part of it, but it was not a cheap movie to make. So, once the producer was on, though, they're thinking what? They're thinking, we have Clooney, we have Pfeiffer, we have the producer from Sleepless in Seattle. This is going to be a hit no matter what. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Michelle? Like, how do you think this thing kind of got off the ground? Because you've been, talking about rom-coms forever. What do you think sort of the secret element was here?
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Dan, is that, like, I think once they had Michelle Pfeiffer and George Clooney on board, like, I had to look back actually at George Clooney's, like, the timeline of his career, because he's at the height of his ER fame at this point.
Yeah,
is that right?
True.
So,
yeah, I think so, right?
Yeah, and I also looked at Michelle Pfeiffer had also been nominated for 3 Academy Awards by this point.
Mm-hmm.
So these, as you mentioned, these are I don't know if they're the most bankable stars in 1996, but they're definitely up there. So I do think that maybe it was like the chicken before the egg. Like, we have these stars. I do question, though, why not give this project to a more seasoned writer if you have such A-list stars?
Totally.
And also, side note, I saw that Michelle Pfeiffer is actually a producer on this film.
Yeah, executive producer. Yeah,
right.
Executive producer. And I think this is the only feature that she's executive produced. So that's also kind of an interesting, I don't know, point as well. Like, why this one film? She must have had a lot of either heart or, I don't know, financial investment in this film. But then clearly, it didn't bring the big bucks upon release, but here we are 25 years later still talking about it. It clearly, like, has some sort of entertainment value. But yeah, I really don't know. That's a really surprising thing for me, that there's not a lot of information out there about the production of this movie, how much it cost to make it.
Yeah, or how it came to be. But I love this quote that you have in here, Chris, under the conception part of our notes. If I didn't have a son, I wouldn't ever have made this movie. And that's the director. Does this feel like one of those personal projects where, Hoffman, just it came along, the producer's like, hey, do you want to do this? He probably, you ask, how does this guy keep working? He's connected to the right people.
Right.
That's all. I mean, that's it. Like, there's just, he knows the right people. He's friends with the right people. It's his network that keeps him sort of getting work, even though he's has never been a very successful director in general. Thinking about that, does the movie reflect that at all? If we think, like, looking back on this, the weakest part of this film, especially in hindsight, do we think it's the script or is it the direction? What do we stand on that? Or is it weak? That's another question.
Right. Because clearly
that was a loaded question. I mean,
Michelle and I are a little biased, probably. Just to be clear, Dan, like, when's the first time you came in contact with this movie?
Is the first time I've ever seen this movie.
Oh wow. Okay, so that's a very different approach. Yeah.
Yes, and I would say it's definitely the thing that has stood out to me more than anything is someone I do like rom-coms. I enjoy them a lot. I love the convention of rom-coms. I love how they decide to follow the formula and tweak the formula just a bit. And so I'm a big fan. I was struggling.
Oh man,
like really struggling.
Yeah, I can kind of see it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but I'm wondering, looking back on it now, what are the things that stand out to both of you where it's like, oh, this worked really well? And what aspects of it do you think are just like, just don't work at all anymore? Like what sort of stands out to you as sort of being the weak leg of this?
I mean, I think that there's probably some fault in both the script and the direction. But so it's hard to say, to be honest, because I feel like one piece of this movie that probably really connected with me back then and probably still connects with me today is I'm realizing as we discuss, the kind of workman-like nature of rom-coms in the 90s, it almost feels in particular like an old Hollywood production. You've got Pfeiffer and Clooney kind of saying quick barbs to each other. The editing, I think, is wonderful in this film. I think it's at such a fast clip. It really does bring to life you laugh at me.
I'm gonna go have to disagree.
I think I just like it's impressive. Kind of like how impressed I was when I saw like His Girl Friday for the first time, of just like that quick clip that never lets up, and it's just people talking to each other, and it feels like somewhere between like an episode of The West Wing and seeing like a play on opening night, where it's just like there's this immediacy to it where you don't have to have a lot happening in the actual plot of the film because the stars are carrying it so much. But I can also see, like, if you don't have any nostalgia for it, that it's a double-edged sword. It's still it's just two people sniping at each other for nearly 2 hours. But I think that really works on some level. I think I can see how worse this movie could have been if it was different leads. I could see how worse this movie would have been if it wasn't set in New York, if it didn't have that kind of tempo that kept you interested in what was going to happen next, even if it was ham-handed or predictable. I don't know. I think that there's a lot to be said for less is more, especially in today's age. Like I feel almost overwhelmed when I turn on a movie that's made recently, because it feels like there's so many things to keep track of and to have wash over me. But in this, it felt like a kind of a return to simplicity kind of thing. Like it's
a good way to wash out Army of the Dead, which we did
exactly. It's like the antithesis of Army from the Dead.
Michelle, I'm interested to where would you put this in terms of like, well, first of all, would you categorize this as a certain type of rom-com? Do you have, is there a certain sort of just New York rom-com or like single parent rom-com? Is there like a category that you would lump this into?
That's a really good. Sorry, yeah.
No, go ahead. Yeah, keep going.
No, I was gonna say that's a really good question. I've never really categorized rom-coms, which maybe is something I should do. I think when I think One Fine Day, I honestly think 90s. I just think this really epitomizes the 90s. In the fashion and the way the New York was. And also, I kind of came of age in the 90s, so this, I think, I know, Dan, you don't have the historical nostalgia for this movie as Chris and I do, but it kind of transports you. And I don't know, rom-coms are, I know it's a genre that most people love to hate on, but I think deep down, a lot of people just love them and are afraid to say they love them. I think, it's really entertaining to see two attractive people banter back and forth. And Chris, you mentioned it's kind of like The West Wing, where it's just all talk. And you're absolutely right. I didn't really realize that, but I also love The West Wing. So
Yeah,
when you said that, I was like, oh yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you in everything that you said about old Hollywood and comparing it to His Girl Friday. And it was just kind of, and again, I'm just agreeing with you, is that this movie doesn't work without George Clooney and Michelle Pfeiffer. So much charisma, so much charm they ooze on screen, and without them, this doesn't work. So I forgot what the question was. I apologize.
Well, I was gonna ask. I'm kind of interested to see, like, where would you put this? Like, maybe even like quality wise,
Got it.
or like, not to rank it or anything like that. But do you feel like it's one of the better rom-coms that you've seen? Is it kind of middling, or is it kind of on the lower end?
I'm going to say it's low to mid.
Oh, interesting.
Why
is that?
I don't think it's a great rom-com, even though I do like this movie.
What makes a great rom-com to you? Like, what do you think? Like what elements really are the spark?
Oh man, that's such a good question. And I've never really been able to fully articulate so much because it's such a feeling I have.
Yeah.
I think chemistry between the stars is necessary if you're going to do a rom-com where all we do is just see two people fall in love with each other. So chemistry, I think, is really important. That makes a really good rom-com. I think believability and almost relatability, which I kind of don't really want to say, but I think so much of rom-coms and why they succeed is because we as people see ourselves in them. Or we want to see ourselves in them. Like, we want to fall in love the way that they fall in love. And this whole notion of meet cutes and finding your person and looking across the room and locking eyes with, a very attractive person who finds you attractive as well.
Yeah.
These are all things that I think make a good rom-com, but I want to say a good script is obviously important.
Yeah.
However, I will say that a lot of rom-coms lack this.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of really good rom-coms, right? Like 500 Days of Summer. Yeah. I don't know what your guys' thoughts or relationship with that film is, but that to me was a hugely original film. Really interesting in the way that they told that, quote, not love story.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think the reason why some people love rom-coms is just where and when they saw it in their lives and how it might have shaped their perspective on love, which sounds so dramatic to say. But as someone who watched a lot of rom-coms growing up, it definitely shaped my view on love. And I think that can be true for a lot of the friends I talk to on my podcast as well, is that if you watch something at a certain time in life, it really shapes you, who you are, and maybe the outlook and how you treat love.
Oh yeah, I think that's 100% true. And I think what's interesting is, like, you bring up relatability as like a key aspect of, maybe what makes a rom-com really successful or not. That's one of the questions that like popped up for me in this. It's a New York centric film, which everybody romanticizes New York City, but these characters, do we feel like they're relatable? Okay, she's an architect, like every person in a 90s movie.
Love it.
How many I don't know. And he's a news reporter. Those are like not fantasy jobs. Obviously they exist. But like they're not super common jobs. Do we find that like these characters specifically were relatable? I would say, for me, not really all that much. And here's the thing that sticks out to my head, and this is going to sound really ridiculous and maybe petty. When are they working in this movie?
Oh my gosh! Like the architect model or whatever.
Like, when are they actually doing work? And I get it's a movie, whatever, but like that to me was sort of stood. I was like I'm on my computer like 8 hours a day, 9 hours a day straight. Like, I'm not like running around doing stuff or errands during the day when I'm working. And it's like there's that phone call she has with her sister, and how her sister is like, she's the CEO of the household.
Oh yeah.
And this could bring us into the gender politics of what's going on in this film, which is a minefield. Let's make no mistake about that.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Do you guys think that they're relatable characters? And if so, if not, does that change the maybe quality of the rom-comness that's going on here?
I mean, I think Pfeiffer's character is a lot more relatable than Clooney's. I think that there's definitely a fantasy element involved in all rom-coms, and it's especially kind of exaggerated here to maximum effect. But I do think it mostly works for me, anyways, because while it's definitely a co-billing of Clooney and Pfeiffer, I think it's just edged a bit towards Pfeiffer. I mean, she's the one that is still awake at the end before they fall asleep together on the couch. And so I think that really helps to kind of situate her in a sympathetic way. But Clooney is just like I kind of said earlier, the whole point of the film is to change his vibe from jerky, cocky guy to realizing that he needs to kind of grow up a little bit. It's the man-child thing. That was interesting because that wasn't really a phenomenon until like Knocked Up in the Apatow verse, right? But that's definitely heavily, at least especially in the first act of the film. But then there's all, like you said, it's the gender politics, because then so much of it is focused on Pfeiffer needing to, delegate more or trust people more, and it just feels like, I don't know, it feels messy to the point where it definitely doesn't want you to really give an inch, especially probably in that like big sparring match towards the end where they're like literally saying themes to each other about relationships and marriages. But I think that in the end, like I said, with any other actors, you wouldn't be able to get to that fantasy. You wouldn't be able to live in that fantasy temporarily for the duration of the film. I don't know I would be curious to hear what you think, Michelle, from the point of view of someone who's lived in New York and somebody who has been watching and kind of piecing apart these kinds of movies for so long, and maybe more in depth than Dan and I ever have.
Don't discredit yourself, guys. I do think, like, I do want to go back to one thing you said, Dan, is about like these careers that these people have is so tropey, but I like love it. I don't know why. It just always makes me chuckle. It's always like the woman who works in food, or the man who, usually is an architect, but I guess this time it's kind of flipped, right? They reversed it. They made Melanie, Michelle Pfeiffer's character, I think off the bat she's depicted, right, like as the strong, independent, we assume she's fearless woman, but obviously deep down we all have insecurities, and I love that we get to see her messy apartment at the end. But relatability, I think, is really important, and but I also think that the opposite is true. Like, it's also aspirational. So, as a young person watching rom-coms, you're like, oh, love could be this way, which again goes back to why I mentioned like love shapes the way, or these movies shape the way that we might view and think about love. I also wanted to talk about a little, or mention, I guess, I know one of the prompts you have here is that like there's rom-coms are predictable or formulaic, right? Hang on one second. Yeah, how much formula do you want in your rom-com? I apologize if I'm skipping ahead.
No, go for it.
But I think for me, I do want formula in my rom-com, which might be a bad thing to admit, but I think that's just the genre of rom-coms also, which is why so many of us lean into them, is because we want that comfort. We want that predictability. We know we want to sit on the couch with that blanket that covers our toes, as you mentioned in the beginning of this, Chris. Like, it's indulgent and silly, but yet here we are. The rom-coms kind of speak to who we are at the heart, which again sounds really dramatic, but love is messy, love is hard. And I think a lot of these films, and this one in particular also, it does bring you some hopefulness at the end.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's why I don't, box office numbers, this movie did not do well successfully. No. But I'm sure there are people out there who love this movie.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Yeah, but it's funny you say that, like that comfort, like the formula part of this. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the reasons I love rom-coms. I also love Lifetime Christmas movies. No, Hallmark, whatever. Like both of the channels, they're both fine.
Yes.
I love the ABCD. I love the paint by numbers of those films because it's just it's so comforting. You know the plot, and there's just there's an enjoyment and comfort out of that roteness almost. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why I didn't like this movie that much, because it had certainly the tropes there, but there's a couple of things that work against it. It's a single day. Mm-hmm. So we can only see a little bit of transformation in the characters over that not even 24-hour period. So that works against it a bit. It does propel the movie forward and give it motion, but there's not a lot of change happening with the characters. At the end, it kind of feels pretty slight. Like at the end, they're together in her apartment, and there's literally on the couch falling asleep together, but it doesn't really feel like they've climbed a mountain, if you will. Like they haven't really overcome anything.
Right.
And I think to me, that's what really, you want those characters to hit a home run, and here they hit like a single. And you're like, oh, this is cool and great, but no, I want to see them like develop and, get married or be partners, whatever they want to do, and see that sort of blossom. And we never see that. It's just like almost like a slice of life rom-com. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things where it's sort of like, it doesn't have the grandiosity. The city's there, and like the stakes feel like they should be there, but it doesn't play out that way. It feels like a pretty small victory for both of these characters. And I wonder, upon release, like Michelle, you mentioned, it did not do that well. Mm-hmm. Like it made $43 or $46 million at the box office back then. And I will note, no international release whatsoever, just domestic, which is even strange for back then. Because at least it would go to Europe or something like this. That's nothing at all. And I kind of wonder why that is. I don't know if they didn't think, these are both very bankable stars, I think, internationally. Right. So why, and then we also get some notes about, and Clooney kind of revealed this in a recent interview, I think it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
He mentions that Michelle Pfeiffer was a producer, and Pfeiffer basically says, this thing tested extremely well. So well that they moved up the release, and they kind of got put in a bad spot. They weren't able to do a lot of press, and it didn't really do all that well upon release. What did it do opening weekend? 6 million opening weekend. It had great legs, but it opened so low that it couldn't really make up the cash that it needed to be a success. The big question is, what happened? You can blame the bad press cycle, kind of the release date or whatever. Those are producer excuses at the end of the day. If something's good and it connects with people, it's going to succeed. Why did this not succeed back then in 1996? Like, what was it about the film specifically that you don't think really connected with audiences at that time?
I think one important detail, you're right, we can't just blame marketing and what have you, but this movie came out a week after Jerry Maguire.
Oh.
And so like that's gotta eat at so much of that potential. So like I don't know what they're thinking. They were just completely discounting like a Tom Cruise vehicle, but I don't know. That's a very strange move on behalf of the studio. But I also think that it was still in this time period kind of a gamble to try to turn a TV star into a movie star, right?
Good point.
And this is a very different audience than From Dusk Till Dawn. I don't even know if From Dusk Till Dawn was technically a wide release earlier that year. And Michelle Pfeiffer, while definitely one of the biggest stars of the 90s, I think she was partially on her downslope at this point, popularity-wise. She had another hit that same year, Up Close and Personal, which is arguably even more forgotten than One Fine Day, and also a huge bomb and a bigger bomb than One Fine Day to Jillian on her 37th birthday. But Dangerous Minds came out the previous year, which is arguably her biggest role, her most iconic role anyways, right? Maybe tied with Catwoman. And then she had it was kind of like, I don't know, not that she ended up becoming a supporting actor the next decade for the most part.
Yeah.
Other than What Lies Beneath and Midsummer Night's Dream, which was with the same director, by the way. But you don't have really, yes, you have bankable stars, but you don't have like sure bets like you do with Tom Cruise and Jerry Maguire, I don't think.
Yeah, and if I may, I think you bring up a really good point, Chris, is that like Michelle Pfeiffer, looking at her IMDb, it doesn't look like she did a whole lot of comedy.
Right.
I think she's really excelled in doing her dramatic roles. And as you mentioned, at this time, it wasn't a thing for TV to cross over into film, like, George Clooney inevitably did many years later, successfully, I guess. He tried with this, and like Batman and Robin didn't really do so well. But I think this is also the first time we see him in a comedy role. So maybe, I don't know, the public just wasn't willing to or ready to see these two stars in this type of vehicle. And Dan, you mentioned also like this film taking place in one day, and we don't get a lot of story development or character development. Everything we see is just boxed into less than 24 hours. And I was kind of reflecting on this a little bit because I think that compared to today, we as an audience, I think we're so much more savvy now. Like we want more depth. We want that story arc. We want, all these mini series are now 10 episodes long where they probably could have been an hour and a half, 2 hour long movie.
Yeah.
But I think that it's so 90s in that sense. It's that we don't have all that depth that we get to see on screen. So I think that this was maybe the easy way out in terms of the script was let's just make it a day and be done with it.
Well, I think that was probably a selling point because this is like, it kind of feels a little bit postmodern. And they're like, oh yeah, single day, this will be great. This is, I guarantee that was a selling point.
Right.
With the producer and stuff like, oh, this is unique. It's different. That's what producers are. It's different. It has a unique style. I just think, I don't know. It just feels like they shoot themselves in the foot with it because it's like, you just can't do all that much in a single day. And, I think another thing too about the release, and Chris, I had no idea that Jerry Maguire came out right before this. It was also a holiday release.
Yeah.
Does this work as a holiday movie? Like, this does not seem like a holiday movie at all to me.
Yeah, this should have been a spring release. I mean, it does not take a box office analyst to figure that out, I don't think.
Right. I would agree with you on that. That is very, very strange.
Yeah. Because could they have shoehorned in like that it took place near Christmas, and instead of goldfish, it was like a Christmas present or something? Maybe.
But it's raining constantly, not snowing.
True.
So it takes place in spring.
Exactly.
So it's like, I mean,
they would have had to retcon the setting if they wanted to make this a holiday release. There are some movies that like surpass that, where it doesn't need to take place on Christmas to be released on Christmas and still be successful, but this does not seem like one of those.
Yeah.
Totally.
And so, I mean, the critics kind of were like, 51% Rotten Tomatoes. They didn't love it. The audience score was a cinema score of a B+, which is okay. For something they see like an A- would be successful. But B+ is not terrible. Letterboxd score right now is a 62, which is decent to the bad scale. So it doesn't really have a following among film snobs and art film aficionados. I mean, the big question I have, and one of the reasons I think you picked this, Chris, and one of the reasons we wanted to have you on, Michelle, is to sort of talk about rom-coms from like a bigger perspective and like where they've been and where they've gone. And this is clearly kind of a middle of the road, I would say, at least in my opinion, 90s rom-com. It has all sort of the elements that you would expect. It has the ending that you expect. It plays really well to some of the formula. I'm kind of wondering, where does this stand in terms of the history of rom-com, and where has rom-com been over the last sort of decade or so? Because we were looking at like, box office receipts and the number of rom-coms made, and this is a genre that kind of fell off a cliff about 10 years ago, and it's just not popular anymore. So maybe this is a good question for you, Michelle. Why do you think that happened? Like, why? And this one wasn't so successful, but there were tons of rom-coms that were successful back then. I think the biggest one ever is My Big Fat Greek Wedding in 2002. What do you think happened since then? Like, what was there for audiences back then that they enjoyed and loved that maybe is not there anymore? Or why do you think that the box office for these films has just dramatically fallen off?
That's a really good question. And I've thought about this a little bit because I think what happened back in like the early aughts, because there was a string of really successful rom-coms in like the mid to late 90s, the early aughts. But if I'm just being honest, and if I could just put this plainly, is that I think the writing got really lazy. I think like it started talking down to the audience. And I think that that's probably one of the big reasons why a lot of people just started writing rom-coms off. It became so predictable where if you see Matthew McConaughey being billed on a rom-com, you're like, okay, I guess, whatever. You're maybe not that excited to see it. You might go see it, but is it going to stick with you and change your life? Probably not. And I think anyone who's going into those theaters or seeing those movies already knows what they're getting themselves into. But, I think recently with Netflix and more streaming services, rom-coms are back on the rise again, for better or for worse. I'm going to take it for the better, though, because I'm excited to see new stories being told, more representation being shown. And I think with online dating being so big, and grown over the past 10 years-ish, there's probably more stories to tell. But I will say, though, those kinds of stories I feel aren't really in the traditional rom-com sense. They're kind of being told in stories of like Master of None.
Yeah.
If you guys have seen that show. So it's a little bit what's the word? It's smart, which as I mentioned, I think the downfall of rom-coms is just that they've been lazy in writing. People want to laugh and to find love aspirational for those who don't have love. And I think that those bad movies that came out, they just weren't aspirational. They maybe weren't even, they probably weren't that funny. They didn't touch your heart and make you feel emotional. So I think the good ones, like My Big Fat Greek Wedding, it was an original story, and it's a new story that most of us hadn't seen before. It's told through the eyes of a Greek American. And I think the reason why that movie did so well was A, it was funny, B, it was something new, and C, it was like, yes, it's a Greek family, but I also identify with that. I am not Greek. But you kind of just find so much relatability again. And I think that that's why certain rom-coms really succeed in that space.
Do you have any recent rom-coms that you would recommend for people to see, like on Netflix or anything that came out in theaters? Like anything in the last 10 years.
Oh boy.
Anything that pops into your head?
Sure. I really liked Palm Springs. That was really fun.
Yes.
Loved it. Absolutely loved
it.
Yeah, it was really funny. I mean, like the story was Groundhog Day-esque. Nothing really new, but it was really smart in the way it told that story. Another film that I really liked is, I'm laughing because I don't know if it should be on this list, but Set It Up on Netflix.
Oh, yeah.
If you guys haven't seen it, or have you seen it?
Yeah, I've seen it, yeah.
I have not seen it.
That's good.
That out.
I would recommend it. Did you like it, Dan?
I did like it, yeah. I thought it was pretty solid, yeah.
Good, thank you. Thank you for saying
Titus
that.
Burgess? Yeah, I'm in.
Yeah, it was a fresh, like the story itself wasn't totally new, but I think that they really brought some modern elements to it. And I'm going to say it, there's some people of color in this movie, which is something that I talk about on my podcast. It's a genre that just only features white people historically. And then I guess I'll also say To All the Boys I Loved Before, which I've obviously aged out of that story, but I'm very excited that that did so well. At least the first film, I'm really glad that that really kind of put rom-coms kind of back on the map in a way.
I would love to hear what you have coming up on your podcast. Like, what are some episodes you can kind of tease for us?
Oh, yeah. So actually, I'm in the middle of doing a trilogy of the Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler films.
Oh, nice.
So just released Wedding Singer. This week I'm releasing 50 First Dates. And then the following week I'm releasing Blended.
Interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Blend. I forgot about that one.
Oh my gosh.
I feel like that one might be a little bit of a rough watch from what I remember. I don't know. I can't remember it that
You're
well.
not wrong. You're not wrong.
I love that you're diving into it though. Like that's the best part about doing this sort of stuff is like, look, I don't love this movie. But it's like fun to explore and dissect why. I almost have more fun with the movies I don't like than the movies I do love. Because when we have a movie we love, like, oh yeah, I love this, and it's like, okay,
yeah,
that's like
what else are you going to talk about?
Yeah.
Well, Michelle, we appreciate you being on the podcast. You've been a fantastic guest. If you ever want to have us on, just let us know.
Absolutely,
we'd love to come on and talk about rom-coms with you. Chris, do you have any closing thoughts about One Fine Day? Because this is your baby. This is your this is your thing. What do we need to get out of this movie if you haven't seen it yet or haven't watched it in a long time? Put you on the spot. I love it.
Yeah, I know. It total. I'm always bad at these wrap up moments. I can't encapsulate it, but it's like it's a nostalgia factory for sure. But I think that if there's anything that really still worked for me on an objective level, I think that if you have any kind of affinity for that kind of like workmanlike pace of the rom-coms starring Jimmy Stewart and whoever have you from the 40s and 50s, there's some semblance of it here, and that's more than you can say for the vast majority of romantic comedies from the past 3 decades. And it all comes back to comfort, and if you're okay with the comfort not being 100%, then it'll get you through a couple hours. It'll help you escape for a couple hours without having to like entrench yourself in horrible violence, like Army of the
Dead. What a great sell! It's not Army of the Dead, so you're gonna love it. Oh,
and it's streaming on Hulu now, so check it out.
Check it out on Hulu. It's basically free. One thing, Michelle, I forgot to ask you: where can people find your podcast?
Oh, yeah, we're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you find your podcasts. We are Rom Com Weekly.
Nice. And then your Twitter's like at Rom Com Weekly, right?
I have a Twitter account, but I'm not an active tweeter. I need to get on that.
Well, anyways, definitely check out our podcast. It is fantastic. This has been Film Choice. Next week, it is my choice. We're doing the new Conjuring movie. The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. Chris, are you excited about this or not? Yes or no?
I am not.
Yes or yes? Yes or yes?
It's the opposite of One Fine Day.
Yeah, exactly. We're trying to do something really different.
We try to go back and forth.
So that'll be out on HBO Max and in theaters this weekend. So check it out and then listen next week to the next episode of Film Trace. Thanks for listening.